Bubbles on a lot here with the conclusion of the Mindfield.
And you were citing the harm principle as enunciated, I presume, by J.S. Mill, who said that governments shouldn't interfere in anyone's freedom unless they're harming other people. So that's a very important foundational liberal principle, but there's a whole lot more to liberalism than that. So if we're asking about the harm in speech, we need to think about how that harm might be viewed through the fundamental principles that liberalism is addressing. So I'm much more optimistic than you sound about the prospects for liberalism itself being able to identify some of the harms. I mean, I have to say, you made it sound incredibly abstract, you know, that somehow having this material out there, unless it's inciting violence, what it's doing is sort of somehow polluting the political sphere or polluting the social context. It's not about the environment, it's about what speech does to people. It's about doing things with words to people. And one of the things you can do with words to people is make them count as inferior. So, you know, we're used to that idea from the law. The law can sometimes make a whole class of people count as inferior. Apartheid law did that. So did slave law. And it can do that when it has authority. So I think that we need to get a bit more down to earth and first of all, get a bit more down to earth in thinking what is the harm being done to. It's being done to people, not just the environment. It's not about pollution. And we also need to think a bit more optimistically about the resources of liberal political philosophy for helping us think about this.
Yeah, I'm interested in those resources, though, Ray, because even the idea of harm being done to somebody so that they feel inferior or are positioned socially in a way that's inferior. In the case of legal discrimination, I feel like liberalism has a clear answer to that because the harm is hard. It's, you know, it's reduced to black letter law. You can identify it. You can easily make clear, concrete corrections to it if you so desire, so as to undo that harm. I feel like where it's a matter of cultural positioning, if you like, or the distribution of social power in a way that's uneven. What would a liberal response to that look like that doesn't do undue violence to the harm principle by making it, or any other liberal principle, by making it simply too broad and therefore illiberal?
So I don't understand liberalism as a particular package of causes. I think of liberalism as a fundamental political commitment to equality and to liberty so far as possible, as long as that's compatible with the liberty of others. That's what the harm principle is supposed to capture. Also, it's a foundational principle of liberalism that it's committed to freedom of speech. But that's because speech has a certain point. It's not just some kind of absolute put your foot down speech no matter what. It's about the point of speech. I'm thinking now of J.S. Mill's eloquent defense of free speech. It's important because it helps us reach the truth. It helps us in our collective pursuit of truth, and what matters is the hero just as much as the speaker. So, I mean, all of these are relevant to the kinds of speech that we're talking about, because it may well turn out that certain forms of hate speech and certain forms of pornography undermine the actual equality. You talk about culture as if it's not real, but of course it's real. What you count as being in cultural terms is who you are socially. So if you are counted as inferior, you end up being socially inferior. If you try and say something and that's not recognized as the speech that you're trying to perform, there's a sense in which you're silenced. So if you care about speech and you care about equality, then it's worth thinking harder about what hate speech and pornography might be doing to the voices of certain people. I haven't said enough about what it might be doing, but I don't want to go on too long.
Well, no.
Single go.
Ray, can you please just pick up exactly that point? Because I really am interested. Because I guess far too often when we talk about speech, we really are thinking about the position of the speaker being able to say what he or she wants. But I think far too rarely
think adequately about the dimension of reciprocity, the extent to which any speech really must both cater for but also expect some kind of response and allow for response on the part of others. I'm interested in what you have to say about this notion of silencing.
So if we are thinking about speakers and what they're able to do, we have to think not just in terms of whether a government is coming down like a ton of bricks on them. We have to think about, whether other speakers too are interfering. So one idea about a lack of freedom is the idea of interference by the government. But there might be other kinds of interference. So you might be trying to express your point of view in a debate, and somebody might be beeping their car on, beep beep beep, shut up. So someone might be blocking your speech in a very literal way by sort of shouting you down or heckling. A heckler obviously is a private speaker who is trying to silence the speech of someone else, and that's inimical to free speech as well. So we need to think who might be the source of the interference when there is interference in speech. But also we need to think not just about that kind of interference, but a different kind of interference which happens when you can say your words and you can get your words heard, but you can't get those words recognized as the speech that they're meant to be. So, and here's where it's a familiar story, the boy who cried wolf. I mean, there's a sense in which certain forms of hate speech do that for whole groups of people. One kind of hate speech was, and still is, explicitly aimed at undermining the credibility of the target. So, for instance, there was a series of children's books published by Der Stürmer in Nazi Germany, which the title of one of them was called Der Giftpilz, which means the poisonous mushroom. And it depicts a mother and her little boy, and they're in the forest and they're looking for mushrooms. And the mother says, "Oh, look out for those ones. They look just like the safe ones, but really they're poisonous toadstools." And the little boy says, "Oh, just like the Jewish people." What that metaphor, they look just like us, they sound just like us, they look completely normal, but really they're poison. That's one of the messages of hate speech, which not only is making Jewish people, count as, as a dangerous enemy, and as to be avoided, and it's going to be have all kinds of effects on what sorts of behavior is legitimate towards them, if you think of them as sort of poisonous and dangerous. But it's also making it very difficult for Jewish people to respond to that, because the very nature of the speech is to undermine the possibility of counter speech. So that kind of speech is inimical to speech. So it's the speech of some silencing the speech of others. This can happen with pornography as well. That's a different story.
There is so much to unpack, isn't there, Scott? So it's just as well we have where we can unpack some of this. I'm still interested in figuring out what a liberal response to that problem would actually look like in concrete terms, and maybe I'm wrong to frame it that way, but I'm fascinated in that. And we should probably return to the pornography discussion as well, shouldn't we, Scott, to see if we can flesh out the extent to which that does perform this function. But that's it for the radio portion of the show. Ray, thank you very much for joining us, and please do hang around for the next bit. That's Ray Langton.
Yeah, well, that was a kind of a dog's breakfast, wasn't it? Bit all over the place. I agree with the observation that public adoption or public acceptance of pornography as being just a normal part of life, it occurred so gradually in some ways and so suddenly in other ways. I mean, magazines like Penthouse and Playboy appeared on the scene, and suddenly it was no longer unusual to see bare-breasted women in tabloid newspapers, bare-breasted centerfolds, in the sort of magazines that decorate takeaway food shop waiting tables and doctors' waiting rooms and tyre service waiting rooms. It's pretty normal these days to see some level of social nudity in the media that back when I was a kid, that sort of stuff would have been black and white, very blurry, sold in a brown paper bag and kept under the counter and only available to people who were over, well, when I was a little kid, 21, and then as a teenager, people who were over 18. And it was always seen as progressive that more and more pornography was tolerated. There was an attitude that if pornography was restricted, then people's unsatisfied lusts would build up and fester, and a level of pressure would arise to the point where these people would go and do things that were socially regrettable, in the way of abducting the target of their lust fantasy, or raping them. So yeah, there was a school of thought that held that if you allow the dirty old men to have some pornography to go and masturbate to in the privacy of their bedroom, then at least they're not turning up at the Gold Coast and being a toolie when the schoolies are trying to celebrate the end of their high school certificate. And then there was another angle, was that if a woman or a man wanted to photograph or film or video themselves in the throes of sexual passion, that was their freedom of self-expression and they should be allowed to do it. There were some limits set on the ages of the models, and of course there was a commercial pressure to cater to the taste for ever younger looking models. So they'd get a flat-chested 18 or 19-year-old and dress her up in bobby socks and have a strip off a school uniform. And there was not much legislation or regulation or policing of the kind of themes that were propagated in the pornography. And the internet and social media has meant that there's probably not much of a career path these days for professional porn stars, because there's so many eager amateurs using their smartphones to make movies in their bedroom, and they're putting them out onto the internet for free. How can you, like, what's your business model if you want to charge money to take your clothes off in front of a camera when there's tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are out there saturating the market? I think really the most sensible way of dealing with human reproduction and sexuality and issues of what's acceptable and what's not is the Swedish model. You know, in 1965, they decided that what they should do was give their kindergarten kids 1 hour per week of formal lectures in human reproduction, and then just continue that until the end of high school. So the kids emerge with 500 hours of formal lectures in human reproduction. And you can't just stick to the plumbing and the mechanics and who's got what and where it goes. So they covered all sorts of things: gynecology, urology, sexually transmitted diseases, infant nutrition, maternal nutrition, childbirth, obstetrics, financial counselling, relationship therapy, first aid principles, changing babies' nappies, all of the ancillary subjects which are attached to human reproduction. And what they found after, I think it was in 1995, that they called a halt to it and drew a line under it and published the results, and it was covered in New Scientist in 1997, compared to Edinburgh, where the kids had 1 hour of sex education once just before leaving high school at the end of year 10. The Swedish kids had a higher age at first sexual encounter, a lower rate of being sexually abused. They had a lower rate of relationship breakdown, a lower number of relationships before getting into a permanent relationship. They had a lower abortion rate, a lower unwanted pregnancy rate. They had lower rates of cancer and heart disease, lower rates of unemployment, lower rates of being bankrupt, lower rates of being arrested by the police, convicted in the courts, lower rates of imprisonment, lower rates of seeking psychiatric help or being put away in the home for the bewildered. By every measurable standard, if you want to handicap your children's lives, keep them ignorant about human reproduction, and sexuality is a part of human reproduction. So what we seem to have done is kept the kids ignorant while unleashed pornography onto the society. which doesn't make a great deal of sense, because the kids are getting, quote, educated, unquote, as to what's normal, unquote, by what they see in the porn videos. And I don't think that's doing anything good for society. Anyway, we're on the upload limit. Warble's on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.